everyone. So as you know, each week I ask the questions at the end of the service, what are you going to do about this and who are you going to tell? So now today I want to ask, how did that go? How did it go last week? Did you tell the people that you were going to tell, or that you said you were going to tell, and did you do the thing that you said you were going to do? I want to share 3 stories here this morning. 2 of them happen to be about people who did what they said they were going to do. Now the first one is from somebody who, he knew that his neighbor had been injured. Now his neighbor is a firefighter, and he had injured his shoulder, and so he was unable to work. That's an important thing, to have that ability to even carry a 180-pound person out of a burning building or something like this. And so he determined, after I challenged him a few weeks ago, he said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to pray for my neighbor. But Lord, I don't want it to be a forced sort of thing. So I just ask God that you would open up the opportunity for me to pray for my neighbor. And so, as it happened last week Sunday, just as he was getting out to, get his family and go, he walked over and he said, I'd really like to pray for you. Could I pray for your shoulder? I know this is bothering you, it's keeping you out of work. And his neighbor said, yeah. And then so he welcomed this opportunity. Isn't that a beautiful thing where it doesn't have to be a difficult thing, it doesn't have to be a big thing, but he prayed for his neighbor. Now, I want to ask you, when his neighbor turns and starts to have an interest or something in his life that drives him to the Lord, who is he going to turn to ask about that? It's going to be this person from our church even. Well, here's another story. Someone in our congregation has another neighbor a little bit farther down the street, down the block here. And this neighbor is a recent immigrant from China. He speaks very little English. And so this woman, as she was trying to share and trying to get to know him a little bit, she asked him, this is maybe a little bit more bold, are you a Christian? And he said, I really don't understand. My English is just very little. And she kind of explained further, well, do you love God? Do you want to know God better? That sort of thing. And he said, oh, yes, I do. I love God, but I'm just learning a little bit, because in China, we were kept from learning these things. And so she had that opportunity to share with him, and she said, I don't know what I should think of this. She said, well, you can come to church even if you don't understand. I don't know if that was to say, well, none of us understand at church, so just come on in, you can sit with me. But nonetheless, isn't that another beautiful story of her sharing with her neighbor and that message getting out from these simple challenges each week? Now for the story that's not so good. Last week I challenged you with Paul's words not to do anything from grumbling or arguing, right? Well, this week I had to add 3 phones to my telephone account with Pure Talk Wireless, which meant that I had to call AT&T. You can already see where this is going, right? No problem with that whole issue, right? Well, I issued the request to transfer the numbers from AT&T, and then I found that AT&T somehow had 2 account numbers associated with this account, and so they rejected the request. Okay, so I straighten that out, I get the second account number to them, and then they finally transferred the numbers. Oh, great. So I turn on the phones with Pure Talk, I call my family, or let my family know by text, hey, you can just reboot your phones and it should work, right? Unfortunately, AT&T released the phone numbers, but they didn't unlock the phones. And so each of the phones was still attached to AT&T. So I went on to AT&T's website and I tried to release those phones. And they said, well, these phones aren't part of an AT&T account. So you can't release a phone, unlock a phone that's not part of your AT&T account. Well, you just removed it from the account because I just asked you to do this transfer. Did I respond without grumbling and complaining? Probably not. I probably did not if I admit things. In fact, I would say that AT&T has a new nickname for me, David's Sanctification Machine. Because this company seems like it was designed just to to purify my soul.
Amen.
Okay, I'm not the only one. I did catch my grumbling and complaining, though. I certainly did. And I wrote it into a sermon illustration. So today we are looking at iterative accountability. Accountability where someone can ask us, did you do all things without grumbling or complaining? Iterative means that it just happens again and again. It happens repeatedly because you can't just ask someone one time, are you following the Lord? And then forget it from that point on. It's almost like a daily thing or like an hourly thing where we need people in our lives who are going to ask us these important questions. So, let's turn to Scripture here. I think this is as good a time as any after we go through my purification and sanctification company. If you don't have an easy-to-read Bible at home, you can see those black Bibles in front of you. I welcome you to take one of those pew Bibles. The whole idea is that those are easy to read so that you can understand the most out of the Bible. And I volunteered those to you. I haven't had any elders complain to me, but it's almost like voluntold, right? I voluntold, we'll replace those Bibles. And I'm sure there will be no problem replacing Bibles. We'd love to do that. We're continuing our series in Philippians, where each week we discover increasingly more that the Lord has packed into the words of the Apostle Paul. We're reading in chapter 2 odd verses, and you can read the even verses all together. I hope all of you watching online are reading aloud too. I'd love to hear some stories about how you're in your kitchen reading aloud, and everybody else in the house is wondering what's going on. Please share those stories with me. That'd be fun. I'm so glad that you're willing to do this, because I think it is even one simple thing that just brings us together as a family. Well, I start out this week with verse 19. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you.
For I know one like him, who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare.
For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ.
But you know his true worth, how as a son with the Father, he has served with me in the gospel.
I hope, therefore, to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me.
And I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also.
I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need.
For he has been longing for you all, and has been distressed because he heard that he was ill.
Indeed, he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow.
I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious.
So receive him in the Lord with all joy, and honor such men.
For he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me.
So what we have here today are two short-term mission trips. I don't know if you picked up on that. I've heard some people think the worst of short-term mission trips and say the worst of short-term mission trips, that they are basically just people asking other people to pay for their own glorified vacation. That's what they think of it. But I want to give a different perspective, and I think you'll agree at the end of today here, as we look at the lives of Timothy, and as we look at the life of Epaphroditus, we'll see something different, a very meaningful contribution that these men make. But let's just recognize it, put it out there, and then we can deal with it head on, right? So out of these two short-term mission trips in today's text, one of them is for the purpose of accountability. One of them is for the purpose of the Benjamins. It's all about the money. But the interesting thing is, it's not about the short-termers using up all of that money. No. We'll get to that here in just a minute. How did Paul keep the Philippians moving forward in their faith? Well, he sent people to keep them accountable. And out of that, we get this idea of witnessing no matter what. Today, as we even look at the idea of a martyr and almost a martyr is a witness. And so keep that in mind as we repeat this phrase, witness no matter what. Well, the first one is send the pastor. He'll fix it. Why can we think of Timothy as a short-term missionary? Because he traveled to Philippi and then back to Rome. He went to Philippi to learn what the real situation was in the church. And then he took that message back to Rome. That's what Paul is writing about. Paul wanted to be encouraged by the news that he would get from Timothy about how well things were going in Philippi. How was Timothy a contrast to the world? Well, they all sought their own interests, but he was genuinely concerned for the people. It wasn't about a glorified vacation. He wasn't just going for his own interests. It was because he was genuinely concerned about the Philippian people. I've been on several short-term mission trips. And one of the earliest was when I went to Romania just a year after communism had fallen. I was part of the male chorus at Northwestern College, so some people might have accused us of going on a glorified vacation. After all, we're singing, right? I mean, how much ministry can be done through singing? Well, in fact, we also went on tours to castles and to gardens as we traveled through Austria. So someone could have said that we were just tourists going on this thing. I would encourage you to take a step back from that and look at it from another. Stories of the households we lived in there while we were there. We did fly into a first world country, Austria, that is beautiful and that through the ages has had amazing luxury and wealth in that city or in that country. Then we traveled to a third world country, Hungary. But Hungary wasn't that bad. It was kind of a step toward what we found in Romania. Hungary had a Christian seminary that we were able to sing at and do some teaching as well. Each night when we went through this 2 weeks that we were there, we split up 2 by 2 to stay evenings at host families and with those host families. All they had to have was a place for us to sleep and to provide us a meal. That was it. Now when we went to Romania, that was not a foregone conclusion. I remember one of those families that we were hosted by was a 19-year-old man and his 2 teenage siblings, his 2 teenage sisters that were there. It was just the 3 of them. The parents, some 5 or 10 years earlier, had found a way to escape to America. And so they did. And they left their teenage children there, maybe even preteen at that point. I'm not exactly sure when this happened. But nonetheless, these 3 siblings were so excited to have these Americans stay with them. Now, they could barely provide food for themselves, but somehow they scraped enough together to provide us food, and they sat and watched us eat. And they tried to dialogue and talk during this time. Now, before we went on this trip, we went around to all sorts of grocery stores and department stores and asked them, would you be willing to donate things to us? We're going to Romania. They are impoverished because of decades of persecution under the communist rule of Ceausescu. And each of us, the 40 people that went, had 1 suitcase for our goods, our belongings, and 1 suitcase of donations that were going over. That's how important this was. This trip relieved 40 families and probably many, many more as we had filled with goods from the pharmacies and so on. Even just basic things that they weren't able to get, but nonetheless we were able to take to them. On another evening, I stayed with a larger family that had only 1 teenage girl that spoke English. Everybody else just spoke Romanian. But she translated for the rest of the family. My friend Barry and I didn't recognize something that was served to us on a platter here, and we asked what it was. Well, the young girl didn't know either, and so she went and got a dictionary and pointed to the entry that explained that we were being served lard, straight lard. Now, there's not a lot of nutritional value in lard, is there? But it's better than nothing. That's what we were served. And so, yes, we ate. I mean, I even asked, so do you put it on bread? What do you do? She just said, eat it. And so we ate just straight lard. Now, I'm not sure what kind of vacations you have been on, but I wonder if any of those vacations included sleeping on the couch in the living room with 3 teenage siblings who were left in the country alone by their parents and could barely afford any food. How many of those vacations were, served where they were served lard, because that will actually stave off starvation. You won't starve if you have at least those few calories. How many vacations would include distributing a suitcase of donations to people who lack basic necessities like medicine and toothpaste and feminine products? Short-term missions has a key purpose, and it is certainly for those things that we can do and that we can go, but it's also for the change that takes place in people's hearts. This October, we're sending a group from our church here to Colombia, and they're raising support right now to go to Colombia so that they can hand carry, just like I did back in 1993, so that they could, or 1991 I should say, so they could hand carry the clothes that are being donated right now to the Andersons, so that the Andersons, the long-term missionaries there, can distribute them. These short-term missionaries are carrying out a critical purpose in the work that is blessing the people of Cúcuta in Colombia. They will hear the needs of those missionaries, the Andersons. They will look at the situation as it really is around the area, in the neighborhood, where there's no rose-colored glasses that the Andersons are putting on. Get to see the situation and to see, okay, what is the impact that's happening here? And then they'll bring that message back to our church so that we can be blessed by this. So that even in some ways our hearts can be broken with the things that break God's heart. Because that's what short-term missions is all about. One of our elders, Mike Bielke, he will be providing pastoral counseling and care and watching over our missionaries, just like we find right here in Philippians. Timothy was a church planter who had planted churches in several cities, kind of like the Andersons. He had a pastor's heart, which we could see in this passage because he cared about their concerns, not his own concerns. Paul said that he was like no one else because he was genuinely concerned for the welfare of the Philippian believers. Everybody else was looking out for their own interests. But Timothy was a one-of-a-kind pastor who desperately cared for the people in remote lands, so that he was willing to make this 1,200-mile trip on foot. Fortunately, you folks going to Cúcuta don't have to go on foot. That's a good thing. We've got air travel. But even though he was doing this, he was like a son in ministry to the Apostle Paul. And yet the Apostle Paul was willing to let him go. And Timothy was willing to go on this trip. I think we can be thankful that missionary accountability is a bit easier in our day. For the past 3 decades, I've been regularly talking with friends by either internet or phone, even though we've been separated by lots of miles. I have one good friend in France now, is his situation, another one in central Wisconsin, and then me in southern Wisconsin and Illinois as well. And here we talk on a regular basis each week to encourage each other, to make sure that we're still stepping step by step with the Lord in our walk with Him. You can see some of the questions that we ask ourselves. These are based on the questions from the book The Body by Chuck Colson. But these are important questions, the real questions that you have to be willing to ask someone close to you that you're keeping accountable? Have you been with a woman in anywhere this past week that might be seen as compromising? And obviously you can flip that if you're two women who are keeping each other accountable. Have any of your financial dealings lacked integrity? Have you exposed yourself to any sexually explicit material? Have you spent adequate time in Bible study and prayer? Have you given priority time to your family? Have you fulfilled the mandates of your calling, even if that's as a plumber? If God has called you as a plumber, have you fulfilled the mandates of your calling? And then lastly, have you just lied to me? Those are difficult questions to ask when you're looking at somebody face to face, but important questions nonetheless. Even pastors, even missionaries, even the Apostle Paul thrived through accountability. Witness no matter what. Well, the second one is send the missionary. He can do anything. If sending the pastor wasn't enough of an example, Paul next uses the sending of a missionary. As you think about these two men, keep in mind that their short-term trips were going in opposite directions. Epaphroditus was sent from Philippi to Paul, both to check in on Paul, to see how the work was going, but then also to hand carry a large sum of money that was used to support Paul in his ministry, this generous gift that he was going to bring. Timothy, on the other hand, was sent from Paul, from the work that was being done in Rome, to the sending church in Philippi to check in to see how things are going back there on the ground in this sending church, so that he could take his message back to Paul and cheer him up with that good news. So these two men are going, or would be going, in opposite directions. Timothy hadn't left just yet. Well, at this particular point in my life, as I was 21 years old, I knew I was preparing to be a missionary, but I didn't know I would be trusted quite like this. I was 21 when I was handed an envelope full of cash equivalent to $2 million in today's context, and asked to carry it on foot across a city of 20 million people, about the population of New York. I was told not to stop and talk to anyone, to go directly to a particular church, and to deliver that money only to Pastor Nigel and no one else. If Pastor Nigel was not there, I was not under to anyone else. In fact, the money totaled just $12,000, still a large amount of money, a large amount of cash that was put into my waist bag as I walked. But in a country where the average income was only $300, this was 40 people's annual income, which would be the equivalent of $2 million today. I was doing the same thing that Epaphroditus was doing. Zelle and PayPal weren't available to instantly send money, so Epaphroditus was sent with a bundle of cash to support the missionary Paul in his work. In the same way, I was entrusted with delivering a huge sum of money in person. I was using what is called the defender's advantage. No one had any reason to expect that a 21-year-old young man walking through the streets of Cairo, Egypt, with the equivalent, or would have the equivalent of $2 million in his bag. Why can we think of Epaphroditus as a short-term missionary? He was doing the work of ministry for the church. And then he was going back to where he came from. He traveled to Rome and he came back to Philippi. He had a delivery to make of support for the Apostle Paul. On account of that, I kind of picture Epaphroditus as kind of a beefy guy. I mean, traveling back then, especially with a big bundle of money, it was left up to you to protect that money. I don't see him as a sort of pushover sort of guy. Travelers with a mission like this wouldn't be trusting in security by obscurity, which was what I was doing. No, nobody will expect or suspect me because I look just like any 21-year-old American guy traveling as a tourist. Not so with Epaphroditus. It was more rare for people to be traveling, and it was almost certain that when they did travel, that they had money, perhaps lots of money. Here's what Paul wrote about this man. Indeed, he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him. And not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy, and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. Now I'm going to back up just a little bit in this passage, because I want to point something specific about Epaphroditus, and that is from verse 25. If you look back to that one as well, it says just this: I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. Now we know about the ministry to Paul's need, right? We know about how he labored with him, how he was a believer in the Lord as well, so he could be called brother. But what is this about your messenger? Well, that's apostle. That's the word that's used. An apostle was a missionary. That's the word for missionary in Koine Greek. In other words, Paul was saying he's your missionary. He's your guy. He's the one that you sent with a purpose for me and for my benefit. Thank you for sending him. He's this one. And this missionary that he sent was so important, and so important in Paul's life, and yet he risked his own life to do this. He got sick with, it wasn't just a bad cold. I can almost guarantee you that. A bad cold doesn't take you near to death. But he got sick from all of this. And that was the life of Epaphroditus. That's almost all we know about him. We don't know a whole lot, but he nearly gave his life for Christ to support the work of Paul in this ministry. Knowing that about Epaphroditus' story, there's a question that naturally comes up when we think of his sufferings. Epaphroditus nearly died, but he didn't die. Does that mean that he was almost a martyr? I mean, a martyr is dead or alive, right? I mean, that's how we think of it. He certainly wasn't killed for his faith. He would have been killed by some amoeba or, virus or something like this. He wasn't killed by somebody who was taking a knife to him. So would he have been a martyr? In the way that we use the word, no, he wasn't a martyr because he didn't die. You're either dead or you're not dead. So no matter how close Epaphroditus was to death, he didn't die. So maybe we should withhold the honor of being a martyr from Epaphroditus. The word martyr is just plain wrong. Maybe we should do as Paul instructed us and honor people like Epaphroditus, because the suffering he went through on behalf of Jesus is suffering that honors Jesus no matter what the end result. After all, God's responsible for the end result, right? But he was willing to give it all anyway because of the love he had for Jesus that was being expressed through the care of the missionary Paul. We simply put ourselves at the Lord's feet to worship and honor him by the actions that we do in missions. If Dan Anderson, our missionary in Colombia, is a victim of a random shooting in a drug shooting or something like this in Cúcuta, Colombia, and he loses his leg, his sacrifice, his suffering is as much the suffering of a martyr as someone who loses his life, because he was in that place for the sake of the name. He was in that place for the gospel. All suffering that we endure because we put ourselves in harm's way for the gospel is redeemed and honored and sanctified as the suffering of a martyr, of a witness. That's what the word means. Honor such people. Well, David Brainerd was a missionary with inauspicious beginnings. He was a student at Yale when there was a revival of truly grace-filled people under the leadership of Jonathan Edwards, who was a professor at Yale at the time. When a division arose between students and professors that had really experienced this grace, and on the other hand, people that just went about their business and hadn't experienced this grace, David Brainerd was overheard saying that one of his professors had about as much grace as a chair. On account of this, he was expelled. But then he became the first student at the new college that Jonathan Edwards started, named Princeton. Little known fact that David Brainerd, a missionary, was the first student at Princeton. Well, eventually, Brainerd went on to have an outstanding career as a missionary and an even greater impact on others because of his 29 years of life on earth. That's not long. However, when he was working among the Indians of early America, he contracted tuberculosis on his short-term trips back into the Indian people and back out, into the Indian people and back out. Well, Jonathan Edwards, even despite this deadly disease that he was carrying, Jonathan Edwards welcomed him to convalesce at his own home. And in fact, even assigned his daughter, Jerusha, 18 years old at the time, to tend to David's needs. And during that year together that he was trying to recover from tuberculosis, the two fell in love and they were engaged. Despite this happy progression, David Brainerd died on October 9th, 1747. It was especially grievous to learn that Jerusha also contracted TB from David. And she died only a few months later. Does that sound like a vacation? Or does that sound like a person who would give all of his life for the value that he placed on his Savior? No vacations in this story. David Brainerd traveled back and forth to the mission field, and what he brought back from those trips was tuberculosis. Still, his journals had such a deep impact on people like John Wesley, Henry Martin, William Carey, Robert McShane, David Livingston, Andrew Murray, Jim Elliot, and even David Cross. How would you care for a dying missionary in your home? That's a difficult prospect, isn't it? I mean, would you be skittish and keep your daughter away from someone so desperately sick? Or would you recognize the risk and still support this missionary to the very end, knowing that you might bury your own 18-year-old daughter next to him a few months later? And that's exactly what happened. Sometimes it happens that way, and we can do nothing to control it because we don't control the end result. We only control our own hearts and our own response of placing all that we are before Jesus, living all of our lives for Him, no matter when that end result comes. Sometimes it happens like it did with Epaphroditus, and he is healed. I want to take this opportunity to encourage you to support those missionaries around us. We're sending out a number from this church. Powerful work for the Lord. I want to encourage you to give generously. Don't take away from what you give to church, but rather give extra because you want to be considered part of their team, faithful members of the Andersons sending church. Just like Timothy, who didn't put his own interests first, but was genuinely concerned for the welfare of the missionaries. Witness no matter what. Witness even through giving. As we close today, I want to challenge you to specifically support those missionaries being sent out. So I'd like to ask all of the Columbia Mission Team members that are here today, if you would stand so we could see who you are going out from us. So we have, okay, we do have 3. All right, very good. Now, everybody else, I want to challenge you to take note of these people, and I want you to go to them before they come to you asking for support. Wouldn't that be awesome if we were able to fulfill their support before they asked? Take this opportunity to support them generously, to say, count on me. I'm in. I'm on your team. So, what are you going to do about this? How is God urging you through these short-term missionary stories that we've looked at today? Who are you going to tell? Maybe someone else who's not here needs to hear about these people needing support to go to Colombia. That you can generate support from your friends to say, hey, I just supported Greg and Carla. You can too. And tell them about it. Be their advocates. Will you tell those people? Let me go ahead and see if we have any requests or any questions here for today. I'm not sure I understand the question. Did you find the pastor in Creo at the church? Oh, yes, I did. Okay, Cairo. That's what it was. And did you ever see the person who gave you the money again? Yes, I saw the person again because I worked for him. I was in an internship at a magazine, a Christian magazine. And so I saw him again, definitely. But in Cairo, yes, I did get to that pastor and went through the process of, he counted out the money and I surrendered it. And he didn't find it missing. So that's a good thing. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we can learn from these stories. We can learn powerful lessons, not just from supporting short-term missions, but going on short-term missions. God, that was one of the things that drew me to this church. That these people here care about reaching the unreached, about going to the end of the globe if necessary in order to tell them about Christ. We want to do that in our own families, in our own homes. We want to do that in our communities. And we want to do that to the